I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach, right? And as Sean mentioned, the bare minimum is educate yourself. Like the information is out there. It's so much out there. Go onto Twitter, go to Yellowhead. Like it's all there for you. There's no reason why you should not have a basic understanding of what is going on. I had someone on Twitter yesterday assume that Black Lakota was a whole nation as opposed to me being Black in Lakota. I was just like, what? I don't I don't understand. And it's ridiculous. I guess the second part of that would kind of be leverage your position, right? And so, like if you have a voice, use it. And we see like great allyship particularly when it comes to other like, person of color communities, right? And so, and certainly, of course, I'm going to like shout out to, Black communities as well, because it's like show up, and the thing is like with Black communities, there's not a lot of leverage there to do, but Black communities still show up. Black and Indigenous communities show up for each other, and that is so important. But other like POC communities and certainly white communities, if you want to be an ally, show up, leverage your position. Like one of my friends, she's Muslim, she is amazing, and she will be on the phone to her MP, like, week after week, leveraging her position, which she has accumulated a certain positionality that, things need to change. I'm trying not to swear. And so, but yeah, like, and that's the thing, like and should not be up to the most marginalized people to like consistently have to self-advocate and educate everyone. And I know today, like, I'm in a group chat with two of my dearest friends, and we're all just kind of hiding because we're getting emails. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I have no words. Oh, yeah, right. I see Terri rolling her eyes, right? And we're like literally hiding under our blankets and saying, I'm just hiding. I'm like, and it's exhausting. Like, you have to listen to us to understand, you have to inform yourself what trauma actually does, right? And we knew this was coming, but with every single, mass grave discovered, it still tears open that wound again, right? And so understand that like we're not at a point of healing. We say truth and reconciliation. Hell, we haven't even gotten to the truth yet, right? And so this is the thing that we have to understand and hold governments accountable. And there's so much like ignorance out there. Like I'm going to rant, and so I'm going to try and cut myself short. But I mean, like Sunday, if you're Catholic, you're going to church, do something, right? Like, holy moly. We keep on, I mean, there's certainly other churches involved, but like, every, last 3 weeks, last 4 weeks, it's another Catholic church involved in this. And there's been no acknowledgement, right? So what are you doing, Catholics? What are you doing, white people? What are you doing, people who with access to politicians and massive communities? What are you doing, unions? This is a big hot topic button of mine, right? Like, just get out there, leverage. You have 60,000 members, do something. I'm going to stop and give space to other people. And so, end of thoughts.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah, it is really frustrating, especially I don't know, like I've noticed a lot of like non-Indigenous people, even though Indigenous nations for years and years have been talking about what was happening at residential school, like only now when there's this like shock value in the news are people like starting to show like interest or care. And I feel like it's also kind of mirrors like what Sean was talking about before, where this past weekend the like city spent all this money on this like security to tear down these encampments when they could have put that money towards housing, which is like we have a big like deficit in. And it's like, why are you spending all this money on fighting it instead of using that money to help them the same way that the government has used all this money to fight Indigenous people in courts for all sorts of reasons, instead of just using that money, which would have been probably less and a lot easier in time and energy, and just like providing the financial support that they should be providing anyways. And it's always like tooth and nail. I just like with people, and yeah, it is really frustrating. So I'm gonna pass that question along to you, Terri. So what do you think non-Indigenous people can do to be an ally and stand with Indigenous people for land back?
Well, I go back to my own Haudenosaunee history, and literally all of our agreements made first with the Dutch and then with the English, and there's even a couple of times we did it with the French. It was all around allyship, like literally all of our agreements. And so we even have a formal process, we call it the covenant chain. And it's literally a ceremony that talks about how do we live together, sharing this place, and how do we live in harmony. We've always had that. And this is part of the problem with like the entire Six Nations Grand River Tract. That land that we originally got as the grant for our service in the American Revolution, the original ideas from the chiefs was that we would allow settlers to stay on our land, but they could only lease it, and they could only stick a plow. Like the depth of a plow was as much of the land as they could take. Of course, settlers didn't do that. But what I'm trying to say is that we've already got these things in place. Part of what we need to do is revitalize them. We've already, like, treaties are essentially the ultimate allyship. And treaties exist across this nation in various shapes or forms. And suddenly, somehow, Canada doesn't think that they're worth the paper they were written on, but they were written on paper. There's like every single nation that made a treaty with Canada or Britain has somehow a record of it, whether it's a oral record or in our case, it's wampum belts. There is a record of these things, and Canada has consistently ignored them. So this literally is on settlers. Settlers need to be the ones to make that reparation. It's not on us. We have done everything right all the way along here. We have allowed ourselves to have those areas where land can be moved away and given away and used for other purposes. And in a lot of instances, it just happened without our say so. So literally, right now, Canada is a nation of, it was created out of treaty. You already have these things in place. Why are Canadians ignoring it? That is my question. I don't think it's us that has to worry about this. It is Canadians that should be worrying about it, because literally the ground under their feet is not theirs. And this is a reality that most Canadians do not understand. You know, when the Alberta was yakking on about Wexit, I was like, where the F are they going to go? They have no land base. They might have a little bit of land around Calgary and maybe a little bit around Edmonton, but literally the rest of the province belongs to the Native nations that they made treaty with. So I am really I'm to this question. It's on settlers to figure out what kind of relationship they're going to have, because we've already made them. We already did all that work way back when this country was like in its infancy. And if settlers don't realize that, I'm sorry. This is why we have these problems with, you know, especially with Mohawks, right? Like, we're not going to take Canada's bullshit, and we will stand up for ourselves. And we have done it on many occasions, and we will continue to do so. And we do it right now. Like, literally 5 miles away, there is a land reclamation going on, because we're tired of settlers coming in and telling us how they're dictating the terms of something that they'd already agreed to. So this is why I get really pissed off when I hear that question, because literally Canada has got all of the templates on how to deal with us as allies, and they don't do it. So I think that part of what has to happen is the younger generation of Canadians have got to say, this sucks, and we are going to live up to our obligations from now on. And until everyone does that, we're still going to be in this situation. And you're still going to have those uncomfortable situations where, like in Caledonia right now, they literally do not have the right to do those, to do what they have done there, to take that land and try and build a housing development. They never had the right. They claim that they did, but they don't. And this is the reality of what Canada is based on. And so I push it back to settlers, and I say, what are you going to do? What is it that you are going to do as a settler to this country whose forebearers made agreements with us? So that is where I'm at. I keep saying, you've got a treaty. You have treaties with us. You figure it out. And so I'm literally, like, especially today, I am not in the mood to hear settlers whine and go, oh, are you all right? Oh, I'm so upset about that. Well, you should be upset. We have told you that this was going to happen literally since the 150 years that the residential schools were in operation. And so if Canadians are like all crying and wringing their hands right now, it's on them. It's not on us. And that's why I get really, I'm at the end of my rope on that question. Settlers have got to be the ones who pick up the pace on this, and they're the ones that are going to have to figure out how they're going to respond and go back into those agreements that we had already made and had already established, because they're there. They're there, and we know what they are, and we still practice our side of it, and settlers don't. So it is literally on Canadians now. It's not on us. That's what I think.
Thank you, Terri. Yeah, I think it is frustrating when for so many years, Indigenous people and communities have been saying the same thing over and over again. So I appreciate that perspective and putting it back on them to figure out what they should be doing, what they need to do. So I'd like to ask Courtney if there's anything, comments that she wants to add to this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always about action, and I think it's always about what are your value systems, and what are you trying to to accomplish, right? Because um, I think that people have a natural understanding of justice, of fairness, of kindness, of wanting to do that, and I kind of push back against the idea of like, oh, it's on people to like educate themselves. Like, I think everyone should just be a good person and like be a good and kind person, because even the folks that I know who are like doing the work on the ground have not done the readings, right? Like people that are actually doing the work and people who are actually like shutting things down and making change and leading actions and doing the work have not read the documents, right? They've not read the theory. They've not read Fanon. They're not going to debate French philosophy. That's not where they're at. They understand their natural sense of justice, their own inherent laws, and they are acting on their responsibilities. And so the idea of like there being this threshold of like you need to understand or have this level of knowledge before you treat people fairly or justly is, I think, something we would get really caught on, where we expect people to understand the entire history of where they're at, and that gives people the license to not actually show up when people need to show up. And I think I've witnessed a real change in a lot of the communities around Six Nations after 1492 Land Back Lane, because you see people, settlers who have understood that an injustice has happened, and they're willing to do things to support the community. So people who have never organized before, people who have never done things before, never thought they would be involved in this kind of conflict, are doing things like self-organizing to drop meals off to land defenders every day. It's led by church groups, it's led by community organizations, and they take turns cooking meals and bringing it down to land defenders to make sure they have a hot home cooked meal every day. And they've been doing that for about 5 months. And those people don't have perfect politics. They're not going to say the perfect thing every time. They're not going to treat, and they make mistakes, right? But we're talking about restoring relationships and actually having relationships. And human relationships are sometimes fraught with misunderstanding. And sometimes you accidentally harm people that you don't mean to harm. But there's forgiveness and there's kindness and there's friendship there, which is that relationship that Terri was talking about within our treaty agreements, right? Like the people that I love and my friends have sometimes hurt me, but I'm okay because there's forgiveness and we have a real human connection. And I think that like we're not asking to be treated as like, for me as an Indigenous person, like I'm not asking to be treated as some like spiritual weird little like entity. I'm being asked to be treated like a human, right? To have human dignity and human failures and human struggles. And that sometimes gets lost, I think, that we're actually talking about like on a real level, like with a person to person relationships. And so I think that everyone can start at a good place from today going forward, and they can continue to build in their advocacy and their organizing and how they build relationships, that will change over time. People's willingness and comfort level with action will change over time. Their ability to like displace power and position, that will always change over time. So people will grow as we move through all these processes, and they're going to continue to learn, and they're going to do that. But again, like unless you start actually doing work, then you're never really going to change that dynamic and build and grow, right? So I think that's I would hope that people have a willingness to do to do, a self-awareness check, but then have an idea of to not get frozen in fear or become intimidated by the whole breadth of Canadian colonial history and expect to need a PhD in that to then engage in discourse or to then look to their local Indigenous communities and think, how can I help promote your sovereignty? How can I help, push forward what you're leading with? How do I then amplify the things that people in your community are doing, right? I think specifically about people that live within the Haldeman Tract, people that live within 6 miles of the Grand River, like that is Haudenosaunee territory. That is a treaty area where the Haudenosaunee people have called for a moratorium on development. So if you live in Kitchener or Waterloo or Cambridge or Brantford or Dunnville or Caledonia, like you can organize to push back against development and amplify the moratorium on development and actually do that work. And that can start now.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for that reminder of just being like a kind, open, honest person. And that's like a great place, I think, for a lot of people to start who maybe are like unsure how to give allyship. So the second part of this question, so what does, I'll propose this to Sean. What does Indigenous land stewardship look like to you? And does that connect to the movement, to the land back movement for you?
I'm happy to go first, but I'm also happy to toss it to somebody else if they'd like to start first this time as well. Know if anybody else like change up our order a little bit. It's only okay. Sorry, can you repeat the question again? I like distracting myself by trying to pass it to others.
No worries. What does Indigenous land stewardship look like to you, and does that connect to the land back movement?
Yeah, so I think they're like intricately connected. I can't speak anymore. So I guess like I would answer this question in kind of relation to how we're looking at climate change and how we're addressing kind of health concerns across the country. I'm doing a project right now across the north looking at the impacts of climate change on climate sensitive infectious diseases and working with elders across the north to better understand what is, so like we have this Western paradigm of One Health, which is this integration of the environment into animal health, into human health, and how these are encompassed through varying ecosystems. Highly westernized conceptualization of understanding stewardship and how we think of stewardship. And I was like, this has been our teaching since time immemorial of how we are in relation with one another and with the earth and with animals. And so our ability to take on stewardship. So I think that there are a number of kind of pronged approaches here. One is that Indigenous folks have to reclaim sovereignty over lands in order to provide stewardship back to the lands and within our communities. I think that this is one of the pieces I'm hearing a lot in the north, is that we have ways forward, and by we I mean the people that we're talking, that we've been talking to, and they say, we can fix and we can help deal with these issues, but we don't have a voice at the table. We aren't being consulted, or we don't have authority to deal with some of these issues, and therefore that prevents some of what we want to do within kind of this colonial system and the makeup of systems and powers to be in here. And so the ability for I think some communities in the north to be able to provide stewardship is through this idea of land back and having sovereignty and having the ability to do this, to do these things. But I also think it is based on allyship and people coming forward, and again, looking at power relations and being kind of in good relations with one another. So through kind of and we look at some examples that are taking place in New Zealand right now, and how some of the governance structures have worked, and how they're reconceptualizing what land means, and the co-ownership of the land and the stewardship of the land as prime examples to doing this. And so, thinking about, are these linked together, is of course, everything is linked together. The relations are clearly there, and that they are inseparable from one another, but that we can't talk about full-blown stewardship of the land without also kind of looking at our connection and how Indigenous people are able to steward that land in relation to the powers and systems that we have in place as a country.
Thank you for sharing, Sean. So I'll propose the same question to Terri. So what does Indigenous land stewardship look like to you, and how does that connect to the importance of land back?
I think that one of the things that 1492 Land Back Lane is very concerned about is that I don't know if you've ever been down to Six Nations, but we have large areas of uncut forest, literally Carolinian forest, the rest of Southern Ontario, and you can see this if you look at Google Earth. The area where the res is very, very green. It's not very cleared. Everything around us has been cleared. And so I think that one of the things that we really want to do is preserve that wildness. For me, a lot of the drive around protect the tract and protect our lands is around preserving that wildness. I don't think that we can have a balanced and healthy ecosystem without places where it's still wild. And so, you know, I look at the land on here on the reserve. My dad has 25 acres that have never been cut. So literally, this is 25 acres that the entire time that we have been here at Six Nations, it has never seen an axe. So these are like, you know, like these are important places. Like there's not that many places in Canada that are untouched. Like we really need to understand that we have a precious resource here. And part of our, you know, responsibilities as Haudenosaunee people is to make sure that those wild creatures can still come, that those medicines grow, that our food plants grow, that the bounty of creation is still here for all of us to enjoy. So for me, a lot of, you know, and this ties back to what's going on in land defense across the globe, you know, where people are trying to preserve these wild places from development. For me, a large part of land back and exercising our sovereignty is around that, is around understanding that we are trying to preserve a sense of wildness. We're trying to preserve something that has been innately part of Yetinistana Owenja, or Mother Earth, for time immemorial. And that is part and parcel of our responsibilities as Haudenosaunee people. So I think that one of the things that, and I think that something happens to people when they start living in a city, and I know that happened to me. You stop wanting to be in true nature. You don't like the bugs. You don't want to be in a place that's inaccessible by a four-wheeled vehicle. You don't want to stick your hands in dirt. And I think that you have to be able to get back into those wild places to remember that you as a human being are as intrinsically tied to the land as any human being. We are part and parcel of Mother Earth. Human beings we can't separate ourselves from this. We are as tied to this planet as the air and the soil and the oxygen molecules in our bodies. We can't separate ourselves. And settlers and Western capitalism tries to pretend that we're somehow better than the real world, and that's not the case. So for me, a large part of exercising our sovereignty is around preserving that wild space and that wild territory and making sure that it stays that way for future generations to see. You know, I mean, I go back and sometimes I kind of like step a little bit into that 25 acres and look at it, but I don't really go into it because for me, it exists as an inviolable place. Like this is where we still see, like I can see turkeys in there. I see deer coming out of there. I can tell that area, those 25 acres, which have never been cut, still support a tiny little biosphere. And so for me, that is worth preserving. That is worth all of the tears and the heartache and the police reports and the intimidation at land back. We need to preserve those places because there's not many of them left, especially in Southern Ontario, which is the most populated area in Canada. We need to have this as an essential reminder of what this land used to be like. And so for me, it's all tied up in our sovereignty. It's all tied up in how we exist as Haudenosaunee people and how we will continue to exist, because we know I have a whole pile of great nieces and great nephews, and I know that they're going to be looking at that 25 acres when they're adults and wanting to preserve it as well. So it's very important to me. I think that land back is in you can't separate our sovereignty from it. I think it's actually really important that settlers see that we are trying really hard to save something here. And I think that a lot of people would understand what we're trying to do if only they would open their hearts to know what it is when we walk in these forests and in these wooded areas, what it means to still be a human being on the land. And I think that for me is the number one reason why we need to preserve our sovereignty and make sure that we exercise that ability to keep those spaces wild. Yeah.
Thank you, Terri. I really appreciate that perspective, so people can really understand like the core reason why like the land back movement is happening. Because I think a lot of people kind of like misunderstand, and they come from this like Western lens of like consumer and ownership, and not really understanding why that ownership is important for taking care of the actual land, since so much of our land and waters have already been poisoned and extracted from. So I'd like to propose the same question to Joy. What does Indigenous land stewardship look like to you, and how does that connect to the movement?
I've kind of been like sitting here thinking about that, like, and how it relates in an urban context and such. And so, but then my mind started wandering, and I started thinking about how, because Terri was mentioning forests and being outside and such. And I kind of wonder, and you look at like outdoor magazines and the great outdoors, and somehow that space has turned into a very white space. So that, like, if me or say Christian Cooper is bird watching, some Karen is going to call the cops, right? Because we don't belong there, right? And so it's really interesting to see how the land went from indigenous to white space. And I mean, we see it all over the place, obviously, within the buildings and the structures and the universities and the roads and such. But, just that simple thing of walking into a forest, right? It's like, it's not considered an indigenous thing unless you're thinking of like, the Walmart indigenous wolves and pipes and blah, 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 the eagles soaring above the sky and stoic Indian sort of thing. And so, yeah, I've been trying to think about an urban context because, I think that, we think about land back as just like, we think about it as on a res, or we think about it as wide open spaces, but we don't necessarily think about it like, what does it mean, to protect what remains in our cities, to protect the biodiversity in our cities as well. Like myself, like I live in Scarborough, I have deer across the street every day, right? And so people's like, ooh, deer. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever, right? And so we have moose, we have bears, right, that wander in every once in a while. So it's really interesting. I don't know the answer, to be honest, from an urban perspective. And so it's kind of a new thought to me. So I want to think about that. Echoing what Terri said, a lot of it is based on sovereignty, right? Words. And so I remember reading, there's that stat that's floating around that how much like nearly 90% of the Earth's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people across the globe, whether it's Canada, whether it's North America, whether it's Africa, whether it's China. Hell, I just, learned a year ago that there are Indigenous people to Taiwan, and guess what? They went to residential schools too. And I'm like, holy shit, man, this is like wild that like to this point that capitalism has spread so much to divorce the people who are protecting the land from the land, right? And so, and to assimilate them and to remove their culture and their connections to the land, which is in itself very traumatic, right? And so when you have ancestral knowledge that is dating back, eons, to have that severed, like, that is wild. I can't even really, I can fathom it because I can feel it in my bones still, but to verbalize it, I don't have the words. I'm a writer too. That's sad. So, but yeah, we have to kind of think about, what the tear from the land has done, not only in the terms of capitalism and trauma, but just, in terms of the world's biodiversity and, the ability to sustain us for, the next 7 generations and thereon sort of thing. So it is, but yeah, I firmly believe that it is rooted in Indigenous sovereignty and just, I can't say that word, I'm so sorry. I'm like, what are the words today? So, but yeah, it is very, it goes back to there. And again, we also have to kind of think about it, like not just in from like, a North American standpoint, what does, Indigenous look like, across the globe? And we don't, myself, speaking for myself, I don't necessarily, it kind of hits me and I feel like, oh, that's really wild that you're not even thinking about it in that context, that yeah, there are Indigenous people, to Taiwan or Japan, but it's like, come on, Joy. But at the same time, we don't necessarily think about that, right? And we don't think about how it looks nation to nation. And there's hundreds of nations on this continent, there's millions of nations, across the world. And so it's a very specific approach, of course, to each nation, but globally, it has to happen. And that's my end of thought.
Thank you, Joy, for bringing that urban perspective. Sometimes that's not really thought about when you're thinking about land, because you're like thinking out there on the land. I myself, as an urban Indigenous person who's grew up and always like lived in the cities, my like experience is so different from my mother's, who grew up in the bush, and all the practices that and ceremonies that like came with that now there's like this disconnection. Like I don't know how to do the things that she grew up learning how to do. And when you said that, it got me thinking about the setting of just like Toronto. And so there's like these small little pockets of parks and like little like forests and things like that. And a lot of those spaces have small portions that have been taken care of different Indigenous like groups or organizations. Like the Humber Arboretum has ceremony there. The different medicine gardens that have been placed in different post-secondary institutions across the city. Brickworks, Evergreen Brickworks, High Park has a medicine garden. And it got me thinking, like, how amazing would it be if these Indigenous like individuals and groups didn't have to like ask permission and didn't have to like work with the people who like own or are in charge of that. Like what would happen if we were just in charge of all of those spaces, and like how much more medicines and how much more like spaces could and things would like grow and give back, and it wouldn't just be for our use, like it would benefit everyone. So when you said urban, that's what came to my mind. So I'd like to pass this on to Courtney if she has anything she wants to add about what Indigenous stewardship looks like to you, and the importance of land back.
Yeah, I think that so much of the land back movement has been Indigenous people like putting their bodies on the line and putting themselves in risk of criminalization. Land defenders have gone to jail, land defenders have been criminalized. And for like us Haudenosaunee people, like our work around pushing for a moratorium on development in the Haldeman Tract has in part been about safety, right? That like the traditional Confederacy really believed in doing something that made it so that our people didn't have to keep putting their bodies on the line, that um, that they could do something that's a bit more um, that addresses systemic issues and is based on that respectful relationship and discourse, as opposed to continually expecting, Indigenous people to like put their bodies on the line to defend their lands and territories. So, and continue to face police violence, right? Because for Haudenosaunee people at Six Nations, right, like Ontario has spent over $16 million policing 1492 Lamback Lane. There's been major police presence in the community, major attempts from police. Oh, it figures my internet would go out in the middle of my ACAB rent. But yeah, I think that's all connected, right? It's all it's all connected, but it's also like, stewardship ultimately means controlling resources. And I think that there's definitely a lot of settlers who see Indigenous land stewardship as losing access to capital and losing the ability to exploit resources and lands. And that's the real threat, right? So there's this overarching like push to control Indigenous communities, to surveil them, to police them, to keep them in a certain social class with limited political access, because it maintains capital and it maintains a status quo that allows for the rampant resource extraction, right? That's why there's no investments into healing them from residential schools. That's why there's an unwillingness to look for missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's an unwillingness to seek justice, because ultimately that allows for the continuation of exploitation of resources and the exploitation of capital from Indigenous lands, right? Like, and then once these systems finally change, those individual people are no longer going to be able. My internet just hates this rant. It's so funny.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But yeah. But I mean, I think people get the idea, right? It's just like it's all connected, but also like the willingness of the state to reinforce the status quo, which is why there's so much money spent on, especially like policing and displacing people that experience homelessness in Toronto. All of that, it's not like we say, like, why can't this money be spent on housing? Like the money isn't being spent on housing. The money is being spent on maintaining a status quo, and that requires police violence, and that requires state violence, and it requires the state to have a monopoly on violence as well, where that all is set up to maintain our social order in a way that requires certain people to be subjugated and exploited, and it's typically like Black Indigenous people that suffer the most.
Thank you, Courtney. I hope that's that was the end. I hope I'm not cutting you off. I'm going to pass it along to Amy for the next question. If Courtney, I accidentally cut you off, just let us know and let you jump back in.
No, it's okay. I might give up a little bit on my internet for the moment and try to figure something out.
So our next question is also pertaining to the land back movement, and specifically what this means for non-Indigenous people who live in so-called Canada, because I know a lot of them super misunderstand what land back means and what it means for them, because I don't know how they got it in their head, but they always think of mass deportation, and that's obviously not the case. So we'll start with, we'll give Courtney a break so she can get her internet started. We'll start with Joy for this question.
Can't unmute. Some deportation, maybe. So, just a little bit. So I guess to be clear, for me, right? Yeah, deporting people. The people I want to deport, usually are the old stock Canadians, as Stephen Harper would like to say. And so I'm like, the types who would say like, oh, if you don't like Canada, leave. And I can't tell you how many times I've had that said to me over the last 24 hours by old white men. And I'm just like, yeah, after you, right? And so I don't, myself as an Afro-Indigenous person, I don't believe that Black people who are brought here as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, they're not settlers, they're not colonizers. They belong here as well. And I feel like, and I'm going to be controversial, but I feel like they have a role in this land back movement. And so, and I feel, as a Black Indigenous person, I feel that Indigenous communities do also have a lot of work in incorporating Black people into these movements, because there is a lot of anti-Black racism. We have a pretendian list, right? And it targets Black people. So there's that. I certainly do not feel we are on the role of like deporting refugees and such, right? Like I feel, for me as an Indigenous person, and I grew up in Toronto, right? Like all of us were community. And so, not the conservatives, but, and it's just a thing, right? And so I could not, I would not even think to dream about deporting, people from like, the Tamil community or the Pakistani. Like, I'm like, no, you have a role to play in this too. And I want you here as my friend, as you are now, and as my ally. And I see you on the front lines with me, and they often are, right? And so, I'm kind of like, we all need to be together to beat the white people. And so but this is kind of, and I mean, I'm not trying to exclude white people because there is a lot of amazing white people who, you know, I consider friends and who are there ready to tear things down with me. And so this is the thing, right? And I think we have to, I'm amazed by how many people just don't understand the concept of sharing and what it looks like beyond capitalism, right? Like I talk to like Marxists and communists, right? And they're like, oh yeah, well this communism, Marxism's great, right? I'm like, yeah, but have you heard about like indigenous practices? What your philosophies were based on, right? And so the world round, right? And this is the thing. Many people who come to Canada come from those types of communities and understand what it means to, you know, not be greedy, not, you know, resources struck, not like, you know, to not that, you know, building wealth is the ultimate, like, you know, prize, right? Like if I die poor and have like 1 million people come to my funeral and say that I was a good person, I'm a rich person. And that's a lot of belief systems around the world, right? And so it's not about deporting people. It is about, you know, managing this land and learning from systems from the people who have been here forever and so thus have a very intimate relationship with this land, right? And so like, okay, this is how we do it, right? And growing and building that community so that everyone is taken care of. And so that, you know, I'm trying to move into like a abolitionist transformative space. So I mean, I'm like, I'm not supposed to like, you know, eat the conservatives or eat the rich sort of thing, but you know, there's still that petty part of me, right? But it also includes like trying to find space for people who have been bad relations too. And so I don't know what that looks like. I'm hoping someone, you know, more wise and forgiving can figure that part out. But, you know, I feel like there is room for everyone if we manage everything accordingly and within the knowledge that we have had within our communities forever. And I keep on saying end of thought, and I'm saying that as an accessibility part because that's my learning. And so just in terms of people who, whether it's recorded or people who are like coming back and forth and such. So this will be the end of my thoughts.
You brought up a very good distinction there. I notice a lot of people say everyone's an immigrant or settler except for Indigenous people, and that's very incorrect. And it really ignores the nuance of everyone's positions within this society. And again, it also ignores the historical bringing of Black people over to this continent without consent. And we need to make space for them as well in the community, and also our Afro-Indigenous kin, especially in these movements, because it's so important that their voices are also heard. So thank you for bringing that up. And I love that shirt. So I'll pose this question next to Courtney. What does land back look like or mean for non-Indigenous people who live in so-called Canada?
I mean, I think it's having a willingness to participate in the alternative systems and like the local kind of systems that Indigenous people are advocating for. I think it's having a willingness to think differently about, you know, the relationship to land, but also engaging more with like the municipal government structure that often is the facilitator of land dispossession. Like, you know, specifically in Ontario, right? Like the province maintains a legislative framework through the Planning Act and the Places to Grow Act, but it's ultimately the municipalities that are the drivers of that development. And so ways that we can become a little bit more, you know, smarter about development practices and how those happen, whether it's like increasing density in like urban areas or areas that are already developed, you know, looking to do like mixed level kinds of, you know, kind of developments, so that green spaces can maintain their integrity, or, you know, just like rethinking the whole structure of how we're driving development into wetlands and into ecologically sensitive areas. Right now, Protect the Tract has a canoe trip going on where Haudenosaunee people are paddling, you know, the most developed parts of the Grand River, and they're like collecting water samples, but they've like found so much like sulfates and pollution in the water that there's like a film left on their bodies, and there's like a noticeable stench, and there's like so many invasive species, and like the further down the river they get, the less life there is, because like you have to remember that like animals, even though like cities are built on this river and there's like water treatment plants that settlers have access to, like plants and animals don't have access to water treatment plant water. Like they're still just drinking and using the polluted water of the river. And then you see like disfigurations in the animals and things like that, where they've been like exposed to toxins, and so they have like, you know, they just don't look healthy or appetizing. And so I think it's like being aware of that, kind of where you are in your immediate vicinity, like how are you stewarding the land. And I think when Indigenous people talk about like reclaiming land stewardship, ultimately it is because like settler stewardship has failed to protect the lands. It's failed to respect, you know, the local environment, and the growth has happened in a way that harms the health of not just people but animals and plants as well. And so yeah, there has to be this willingness, right? And I think like there's some really practical things I can think of, like, you know, like people that have old farmhouses that are in Indigenous territories, instead of selling them to developers, you could see if the local Indigenous community wants that property back, right? Like that is really useful. And that's something that's I've heard happen with like some farmers, where like they don't want to see their pristine farmland transformed into developments or like cookie cutter houses. They're looking towards the Indigenous community and saying like, can we will this property back to you? Can we give this back? Can we, like, you know, once our family's done using it or our family moves, like, does the nation want it back? And so that's like some really practical ways that things can be done to rethink about that. And I think that like also, and you know, we've talked a little bit about like the urban community and what can happen in urban spaces. Like there's a land back camp in Kitchener right now that's in the Laurel Creek Conservation Area, where the conservation area has been, a portion of it anyway, has been given to the urban Indigenous community for them to steward the land and to provide safe and free access, focused on to us LGBTQIA Indigenous people in the city, so that they can have access to ceremonial spaces that's like more local than them having to travel back to the reserve to access those kinds of supports. So there are some kind of like innovative models for like city spaces. You know, it'd be interesting to see if like, because Rouge Park has a Haudenosaunee archaeology site where there's like Haudenosaunee Village within Rouge Park. Like, would is Rouge Park ever going to be returned to Haudenosaunee stewardship because the bones of our ancestors are there? You know, or is that going to be in the future site of Indigenous land resistance, where like Haudenosaunee people are going to have to like forcibly take their land back, right? Like, what does it mean? How does that look like? And if that comes to that, like, where are you going to sit in these uncomfortable moments, right? Are you actually going to act, or are you going to just sit by and let Indigenous people bear the burden of all of that kind of activism?
I think people often don't recognize that, yes, the pollution that happens affects all of our living kin, plants and animals, because they don't have water treatment facilities. And we see these things as we go out onto the land. And those things need to be fixed. And you're right that Indigenous people shouldn't be the only ones bearing this work on their shoulders and on our shoulders to fix these issues. Just for time, as we are getting really close, we have one final question that I'm actually just going to propose to Sean, specifically a health question. So is there a connection between land and health, and how does land dispossession affect the health and well-being of Indigenous people and our nations?
Great question. Thank you for that. and I think it's what we've been talking about this entire discussion. We know that at the point of colonization and forced removal from the land, that Indigenous people's health became drastically impacted. Indigenous people in this country have the worst health outcomes across every major health indicator that we have. We see the highest suicide rates in the entire developed Western world amongst Inuits. All of these have direct connections to the loss of land, a connection to land, to traditional foods, to hunting, to the environments, to the toxicity within our environments and our ecosystems. But I really want to focus this question around the resilience of Indigenous people, that I am tired of talking about the negatives that have come out of this. I think it's context that we need to have, but that substantially Indigenous people have thrived. Indigenous people have survived like the most kind of explicit forms of trauma, of intense of policy to be rid of us, and that we have survived, that we have thrived, and that we are reclaiming our land. We are reclaiming our connection to the land. We are demanding stewardship of our land, of our water, of our environments, in order to protect those things that are most dear. And I think it's through that we are going to be able to improve our health, that we're able to move away from this intensely, again, Western medical model of understanding health, to bring balance back to each of us. But through bringing back balance, we can't bring balance to the individual without having balance to Mother Nature, without having balance to our connections, but to our communities as well. Until our communities are back in balance and we move back to our traditional governance systems and to have sovereignty, it's only through that process that we can truly bring everything back into balance and to look holistically again at one another. And so land back and land and sovereignty and protection, stewardship are all interconnected to this understanding of health, and that we have to stop disassociating and siloing them, right? Because that's what people love to do. Because if we can move away from talking about the environment, if we can disassociate health from the environment, then we don't need to deal with the environment as a critical health issue that are impacting people. If we can disassociate it, animals, and the way we look at antibiotics, the way we look at the way we treat animals in both farming and mass production of farming, but equally looking at, where have our caribou gone, the fact that we have depleted our oceans, right, to the fact that we now, because we stopped hunting seals, that seals are destroying entire ecosystems due to overpopulation that were kept into check by Indigenous folk since time immemorial. Until we start to look at these things holistically and we start to really rely, not we, but as a society, start to truly embrace Indigenous knowledges, our ways of knowing, our being and our connection to the earth, and we truly embrace that and bring us in as partners, then I think that that's where we need to be headed. So thank you, all my relations.
We definitely agree with that. I know like a lot of the perspective today has focused on negative things, but it's good that you pointed out Indigenous resiliency, because I don't think enough people notice that. Like, we're still here, we're still fighting, our communities are healing, and the future looks good for us because we're going to make it good for us. So, Christina, if you want to.
Yeah. So I'd just like to say thank you again to our 4 panelists and sharing your experiences and your knowledge, and for all the work that you do in the community. And I hope this has opened some eyes and minds in our audience. Like, even myself, I feel like I learned a lot thinking about other perspectives that the panelists brought up. So what we're going to do now, if you go to the bottom of the bar, there's a Q&A chat. So you can propose your questions there, and then we'll read some of the questions out. So just give, we have a couple of comments. So I'll read the comments first and see if any questions come in. So the first comment, I think that in order to make change for future generations, change capitalistic thinking in society, educate the non-Indigenous population, etc., we need to make a huge change in the Eurocentric curriculum education system and methods of teaching and learning. And this person also said thank you so much, and that was very informative. So while we wait, if there's any other questions right now, I'll just open it up to our panelists if they have any final thoughts or comments that they want to make. Terri, please go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that one of the things after, I was having a lot of trouble after the Oka crisis, and because I was at the time, I was only 25. And so I had a lot of anger and a lot of upset about it. And I went to a talk that was given by one of our elders up here who's passed on now. And he said that you have to remember that Turtle Island is where people come to learn how to be human beings. And he said that it was long prophesized among our people that there would come a time where the Haudenosaunee would be surrounded by all of these other people from all across the globe. And it was our job to teach them how to be human beings. And I found that a really interesting kind of way of looking at what's going on here, is that there's a lot before all of the teaching can happen. There's going to be a lot of things that put us through a fire, essentially. So I wanted to kind of look at that, because I really do believe, like when we talk about deporting people, I think that that's a response to how white people would deal with the situation if they were in control. And we see this in the US. They're trying to make it a white homeland. Sorry, but like literally my people were there for 30,000 years before you guys even came here. So it's no white homeland, right? So the reality is those people are talking about deportations in the way they would. They're doing it the way they would do it. We, on the other hand, understand that there's been generations here. This land has given them a home. And for the arrivants, like for the Black people who were brought here against their will, for everybody who's found, safety and succor on these shores, we can't just kick them out. That would be inhumane. We're not inhuman. So the reality is that we all have to learn how to we have to learn how to live together. This is where we become human beings in this. Like we learn how to be human beings with our own cultures and our own ways in our own lives, but living together here on Turtle Island with our communities in place. And that is what I want to see. That is where we are stewarded by an understanding of how this land should be looked after. That is what I want to see in Turtle Island. I don't want to see a place where people are left aside or like the thing about what's going on in communities right now where settlers say, oh, well, you got here. Well, you're an immigrant and I'm not. And that's not true. They are immigrants. And the reality is that us Indigenous people, we did open the door initially. We did say to them, we get it. You want to try something here? Well, you guys, you stay over there, we'll stay over here, and we won't interfere in each other's business. That is the two row wampum in its essence. And over time, that boundary got violated. It wasn't violated by us, it was violated by settlers. So I think the really important thing here is to me is about building a new world, building a better world that understands that there's a really beautiful, a beautiful base here, a beautiful understanding of how to live in harmony with this environment, and that we do welcome people in, but please, have some respect. Have respect for the living beings that are here. Have respect for creation and understand what it does for us. And then we can all be human beings in this place. So I really like to think about that as where we should be aiming for, as opposed to like kicking people off and shutting things down. I mean, I'm with Joy. There are some people that should get deported, I'm not gonna lie. But I mean, the reality is that this is a beautiful place. It is Turtle Island is a paradise. And I think that everyone should, it is humanity's right to be here. We may have been the first ones, but we're certainly not going to be the last. And so I think that in the spirit of understanding humanity, we need to bring that in. Let Turtle Island be the place where people come to be human beings, because that is what we want. We want a place where we're all equal, where we're all, connected to the land, where we're in a safe place, where there's no state violence. That's what we want, and that's what's possible here. So I think that, you know, in the spirit of my ancestors, we welcome people in and we want to continue to welcome them in. Just, you know, like, let us have our space too. That's all we're asking. So now.
Thank you, Terri. So we have a couple of questions. I'm just going to read out the first one. What are some resources and books that would be useful for Indigenous teachings? If any of the panelists would like to jump in.
I think it depends on like what kind of teachings you're looking for. I mean, there's certainly a ton of Indigenous academics who have like published really great books and anthologies and people who are doing that kind of work. There's also like historical texts that are like kind of like firsthand accounts. Like if you really want to learn and try to like decolonize something, like you can read the Jesuit journals. Like those are some really like insightful kind of chronologies, but there's also like great books like The Clay We're Made Of, which is by Susan Hill, which talks about like Haudenosaunee land stewardship and connection to the land. There's a ton of like freelancers that are doing really cool work that could follow, and different reporters who do a really great job doing, you know, talking about Indigenous issues and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I would definitely recommend The Clay We're Made Of, just because Sue Hill that wrote the book also talks about like how do you reinterpret and reapply history, and how do you rethink and how do you kind of read through the context of like colonial violence and kind of racism that happened in like historical documents and deconstruct it to then try to get at what the truth is, contrast it to like oral history and like what might have been the disconnect in that context, in the historical context. But I have to leave, I have to head out. I just wanted to also say thank you to all the panelists and everything, and thank you to everyone for putting this on. And just as like a final thought, I guess like, yeah, I think it's interesting to think about, you know, some of the things that Terri has said, because I think that when we think about like Indigenous worldview, it's important to remember that it doesn't come from Indigenous people. Like it doesn't come from us as like thinkers. It comes from the land itself, and it comes from our creator. Like there are instructions, but it also comes to like the instructions that were given to like the plants and the animals. And so when we think about how Indigenous law is derived, it's like derived from the land. So like for Haudenosaunee people who are stewards of like primarily Carolinian forest, right? Like the trees that grow here are also distinct. The plants that grow here are distinct. The animals that live here are as distinct as we are. And the way that we've all been instructed to work together is what sets our laws and relationships and that balance of creation. And so there is no other place where Haudenosaunee law can exist besides these lands and spaces, because we are from this place and we've been living here and stewarding the land for since time immemorial. Like our bodies were made from this earth, and we are placed here by our creator. And so that is like the basis of this Indigenous land stewardship, right? It's also like respecting the fact that the plants and the animals are makers and participants in that, in lawmaking and nation building. So nice to thank you, and see y'all later.
Thank you, Courtney. Take care. So we're just gonna wrap up now, since we're a few minutes over time. So thank you for everyone who has attended and proposed questions. I'm just gonna pass it along to you, Amy.
So I just want to start with saying Wilaliuk, Nakumik, Miigwech. Thank you, especially to our panelists who have taken time out of their day to come speak with us. We're really grateful that you've taken this time and that you've come here to speak on these topics and really educate us and our viewers who maybe don't have the same backgrounds as us, who are non-Indigenous folks who needed to learn this. All of you do such important work within the community, and this event is a continuation of this work. So again, Wilaliuk, Nakumik, thank you. We also want to thank everyone who came and attended today and listened and learned, and we hope this learning doesn't end here, and that you take this knowledge and you go out and you turn it into activism and you do something with it. We also want to thank YFS and CSACs for helping us plan this event and putting it on. It ran so smoothly. Everything went as we hoped, and we're very grateful for your help today. So once again, Walaliuk, Nakumik. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And thank you for coming to our panel. And happy Indigenous History Month.
Ona.